Good afternoon. Today we begin the sixth in our series of my Bible talks. I continue to get questions from people and have my own prejudice towards what I like to talk about too, but let's talk about some things I've been asked about recently. The first deals with the book of Psalms. You know, the Psalms are wonderful. We tend to remember them mainly from very emotional and moving parts of our lives, like funerals with the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing I shall want. Or other beautiful psalms we've heard during the year. But the psalms are more complicated than that. The psalms really divide themselves into three categories. One is praise of God, almost a liturgy. I think the 23rd Psalm is that, a psalm of comfort. Some of the psalms are formal hymns, probably from the time of David, that were said in the temple when Solomon was king. But the third type of psalm are the historical psalms, and you hear those, for instance, at the Easter Vigil Mass. You know, we'll have a reading about the great exile, the Jews leaving their exile in Egypt, fleeing Pharaoh. And then that'll immediately be followed by a psalm that tells the same story. And biblical scholars believe that the Psalms are probably the most ancient memory of the people of Israel that was passed on orally before everything was written down. And so when we deal with Psalms, we're also dealing with history. So the Psalms bring us truth in very, very different ways. Comfort, praise, and in one case, historical. Now they tend to blend together, of course. But the book of Psalms is more than just pretty words. It's the truth of God demonstrated to us in different forms, as I've spoke of earlier. Then the second question I've got is about the nature of revelation in the New Testament and in the Old Testament. You know, it's interesting because God reveals himself very differently between the two testaments. In the Old Testament, the expression to see the face of God means you've died. So no one really sees the face of God in the Old Testament. What they see is God talking through a burning bush, God in the whisper of a cave, God coming in dreams to people. But there's never a physical manifestation of God in our world. It's always through intermediaries, the burning bush, etc. How different it is in the New Testament. Because if we believe that Jesus Christ is God and man, then God, in a certain sense, physically walked among us. God spoke to us. That's why we have such reverence for the Scriptures and for Jesus' words, because they are the direct revelation of God to us without any intermediaries. It's just Jesus speaking. And how many times do we remember that in some of the most beautiful passages when we read the Bible? I always love the Beatitudes, where the nature of what we should do to gain eternal salvation is presented to us. And as we proceed through life, I think we tend to come more and more to the parts of the Scriptures where Jesus speaks. Not anyone speaking about Jesus, but Jesus speaks, because we know that that is absolutely him that is speaking to us. And so there are so many times in the Scriptures where if we just would listen to the voice of Jesus, you know, there's that beautiful hymn, I heard the voice of Jesus say. So God is actually manifest to us physically as opposed to the Old Testament. Then the third one is, people ask, they've heard the expression historical books. Well, the historical books are the first 5 or 6 books of the Bible that talk about the history of Israel. And they collectively have the name the historical books. They range in very different times and periods. They range in when they were written and when they became part of the Scriptures. They're the history of a people. And history is important both in Judaism and in the Christianity, because we believe that God intervenes in history, that God is not apart from history. And so the history of a people, the history of Jesus, the history of the Christian church, are all part of God's plan. And so this is the God that lives in history. And it doesn't hurt us to go back and to read the historical books, especially in a Bible that has some annotations to get us up to date on what we're reading, because most of it is so foreign to us back in time that unless we have some interpretive abilities, unless there are good footnotes in our Bible, we lose at least part of the historical meaning of what they're talking about. And so we need to be a little more inquisitive, if you prefer the word. Find a commentary, not a complicated one, or even look up a Bible passage online and see what the commentary about it is, because we need to know the historical context of that we're listening to. Historical books are also different kinds of history. Many of them cover history covering 1,500, 2,000 years, and they cover it in a very short period of time, sort of the highlights. When we read the history of the people of Israel, we read about the founding fathers of Israel. We read about Abraham. Then we sort of go forward after Abraham into the exile in Egypt with Joseph and his brothers and the famine that was once upon the land. And then we read about the toils and troubles of those who were taken into Egypt and their attempts to leave Egypt. And that's where we have the great Exodus story. What a period of time that may have covered. It may have covered 1,000 years for all we know, from Abraham to the exile in Egypt. And then we have the history of the recovery of the people leaving Egypt, going back to the Holy Land, and reestablishing themselves in the Holy Land. Then we have the history there's called the Book of Judges. We have the history of Israel before there was kings. God was forever saying to them, you don't need a king. I am your king. But God finally gave in to them, and that is when Saul became king. And then we have the history of David, and then Solomon. But then we have the history of the decline of Israel after it being conquered by so many different peoples, by the Assyrians, by the Babylonians. And of course, in the Babylonians, we have the history of a people again taken in exile. Although probably in the Babylonian case, we're talking about the elites being taken into exile. If you prefer, the educated class of the kingdom being sent into Babylon. And there they were there for a while. There's a beautiful psalm, by the rivers of Babylon, there I was weeping. During their time in Babylon, they kept their faith, though, and there came a time for them to leave Babylon and to come back into Israel and reestablish, at least among the people who were literate, the religion of Israel, the rebuilding of the temple of Israel in Jerusalem. And what's interesting there is not all of them left Babylon. Some were very comfortable in Babylon, didn't want to leave. There's a whole history of Judaism outside of the Holy Land that were the Jews who stayed on in that ancient cradle of civilization in the Middle East and produced a flourishing Jewish culture that actually ran almost into our time before the great persecution of the Christians and Jews in that part of the Middle East. So the history then leaves us and takes us through their return, their problems with people after that, all the way up to the book of Maccabees, which we find in of course, the Catholic Bibles, but not the Protestant Bibles, which talk about the Greek world of Alexander the Great and his successors, and how they attempted to secularize, in a certain sense, make Greek all of the world, and how the Jewish people stood against that because they believed in their one God, much as the Christians stood against that when they were in the Roman Empire for believing in their one God. So that's a huge expanse of history told in very quick terms over a period of time. I mean, you can read a history of the American Civil War, which covered less than 5 years, and that history will be longer than the entire history, the entire corpus of the historical books of the Bible. So when you read carefully and then find some good texts, and I'll recommend some later that help you get a context for all of these things. Again, it's been good to talk to you, and I'll try and come back tomorrow. Thank you very much.